Let's talk about the cool kids table, shall we? Hi, welcome to this video. Thanks for watching. And thank you for subscribing if you subscribed off my last video. It was really interesting seeing how that did and how the algorithm ended up treating that. And that was just an introduction video, so hopefully you resonated with that and you'll find what we're talking about today helpful. I wanted to start with a story and introduce what we're going to be talking about. So I was homeschooled back in my day in high school, and we had a band as a homeschool group. So the various homeschool kids would come together and we had a concert band, and this was the real deal. We sent people to district honor band and district honor chorus every year, and we had skilled instructors, and it was a great time. I enjoyed it. Definitely encouraged my love of music and a lot of other things, and I'm very blessed for it. However, being in high school, we homeschool kids were not exempt from the usual character flaws of high schoolers. So what we ended up discovering, me and my brother, as we were involved in this homeschool band, is that there is such a thing as the cool kids table. And much to our surprise, we found ourselves on the inside of that. So basically, the way it worked is that we would break from intermediate band, between intermediate band and advanced band, and we would go and have lunch. And of course, there was a group of people who were considered cool who sat together at lunch. And so what would happen is we would try to cram as many chairs around a table as possible, and sort of on the inner ring, and you can't get more on the nose than this, on the inner ring you had the people who were cool, mostly the older kids, and they sort of enjoyed themselves and cracked jokes and whatever. And then on the outer ring you had some of these younger kids who maybe wanted to be sort of in on the cool kid action. So this was just kind of, I'm sure that you probably have experienced something like this in your life if you've been in high school for any amount of time, or if you just live as a human. We have this tendency to have these cool kids tables. So this is what it was like in band. The only difficulty is that we were not actually cool by general standards, right? So we're homeschooled. And I, back at that time, I was really big into Call of Duty. So I would show up wearing this bandana tied around my head in imitation of a character from Call of Duty Black Ops named Frank Woods. And looking back on it, it was pretty rough. It was a rough season. But so here I was, and because of this, I somehow managed to become kind of one of the ringleaders of the cool kids table. I had edgier humor. I was on the internet. I knew what was going on. Whatever, fill in the blank. So this is this cool kids table. This is happening at band, and eventually, we really think we're doing something. We're rocking the homeschool boat with our little act. But eventually, one of the ringleaders of the cool kids table, kind of disappeared. He kind of ghosted us and moved out of our lives, and that group sort of broke up. And as it started to fade, we started to realize just how inconsequential that little group of 5 or 6 high schoolers surrounded by some middle schoolers at the outer edge of the table, how inconsequential we were in the grand scheme of things. And or at least I did. I don't know if anybody else did. Maybe some people are still reliving the glory days of homeschool band, lunchtime. But regardless, there's this sort of phenomena of the cool kids table, right? And so that's my experience with it, and I'm sure that you probably have something very similar in your past. And this is not a new thing. People have talked about this idea of the cool kids table before a lot. C.S. Lewis has this really, really great essay, and I'll link it in the description below, called The Inner Ring. And it touches on all of the desires and fears and the sort of mechanisms of these cool kid tables, in the world. And it's a little bit dated because of his time, and probably, but the principles it touches on are timeless. and he's very aware of the kind of thing that I just described to you. This kind of inner ring. In our case, it literally was an inner ring. There was concentric circles of people who were kind of whatever. So this well documented phenomena of the cool kids table is just tracked out in this essay by Lewis, and so he's talking in the essay about how people will. There's this sort of official law of hierarchy, and he uses an example from War and Peace, as I believe, of an officer and of inferior, and how the officer will wait for the inferior while the inferior is chatting up some other guy, because the inferior has more social sort of capital. He's in the inner ring. He's in this higher unspoken social order. And so Lewis goes on and talks about this, and he talks about how when we want to be in these places, we'll be willing to compromise and do all kinds of things. He also talks about the different sort of flavors of inner ring that you can come across, and the different kinds of attraction. There's a person who's attracted by the prospect of power, of influence, and he kind of wants to be in the high, kind of Oval Office life, and so he is very obviously Curry's favor, and there's that kind of thing. But there's also a kind of inner ring of people who are on the outside. Outsiders also create their own little spheres, their own little circles, and these outsiders trade instead of social capital and standing in society. They trade on your lowliness of position. And he talks about the sort of the artist loft or the intellectuals room filled with pipe smoke and whatever, and then this feeling of like, I'm in. These are the people who know what's going on, and they may not seem like much, but I'm in. And so he talks about this sort of thing, and ultimately towards the middle of his essay, he says something very profound about how a man who's looking at one of these lower inner circles, not lower in the sense of lower in quality, but just not trying to gain power. He starts talking about somebody who desires to be in one of these little groups of artists or thinkers or whatever in the coffee house, in the artist loft, and he says there's this dangerous sense that you can get trying to pursue entrance into a thing like this, of I'm pressing to get into this inner ring, and when I'm there, what I'll realize is that I'm with the few people who really know, is the language he uses. Me and these 5 guys, and we get together and we talk about social or political issues or whatever. We really know what's going on. We really understand. And so you're trying to break into this inner ring. I really commend Lewis's essay to you. I think you should look at it. You should read it. He talks about it better than I can in terms of the social setting. But what I want to talk about today is how that extends into the internet, and more specifically, how that immanentization of the cool kids table. So that the immanentization of the cool kids table is basically the idea. Immanent means close, near, at hand, and there's this kind of, because of social media and because of the internet and because of YouTube, which is why it's kind of ironic that I'm recording this video on YouTube, but because of all these things, there's this kind of pulling in and closeness of these inner circles, these rings, and you can actually start without having to do what you had to do in Lewis's day, which is trade in the social capital, right? You had to have the right friends, you had to talk to the right people to get this sense of being on the inner circle. But, well, today, you don't have to do that. All you have to do is really find the right corner of the internet and the people talking about the things you want to hear, and then you can consume all the content, and you can feel like you're in the inner ring. So it's like, what do I mean? What do I mean by this? You want this sense of being in on it, right? Let's take an example of something maybe a little bit silly or whatever, but there's a fad on Twitter a couple of years ago about seed oils. Seed oils are bad for you. And this is just generally true, by the way. This is something that's kind of out there in the health world, and people talk about inflammation or whatever. But on Twitter, there's this kind of Twitter space of people who are kind of in on the conspiracy that everybody else has to make people eat seed oils. how there's this kind of secret oppressive power that's pushing down on us and fattening us all up by making us consume things with seed oils. Um, and there's this way that people who see this Twitter space or whatever start to watch YouTube videos about seed oils. They can start to consume all this content, and they start to realize, like, I know something that my mother, father, girlfriend, brother does not. Namely, that there's this secret cabal of people trying to get us to eat seed oils. And so you can have this feeling of like, I'm in the know. I know about this secret plot, and me and my friends on Twitter are going to solve this, and we're going to create a new lifestyle, and we're going to build from the ashes or whatever. And you can start to characterize your friends on Twitter as people who you don't know, people who you don't really talk to. You can start to look at these people in these videos as like, oh, and I use that example because it's real. It's something I've experienced, especially in theological spaces. It's a thing that happens, and we kind of laugh at it like, oh, yeah, right. There are probably better explanations about the seed oil thing. We laugh at it, but what is that trading on? It's trading on the thing that Lewis has put his finger on, and that I discovered in my time in band in high school, is that there's this inner ring. There's this circle of the select few who know what's going on. We understand. There's kind of secret knowledge that you can obtain by reaching in and being a part of this. And instead of having to trade in social capital and try to meet the right people, get into the right physical place, all you have to do is turn on your phone and scroll to the right feed, and there it is to greet you. More people who are going to confirm what you already know to be true, namely that you are in the secret few who know about the play that's being run on us all to get us to eat seed oils, etc. So this is where I want to springboard off of for today, of like, this is happening on the internet. It's probably happened to you. You probably found some kind of YouTube rabbit trail, some kind of subject, and you've developed like, oh, wow, I know something that other people don't. I'm in on it, right? And what that tends to do is it tends to create what I'm going to call microcultures. Echo chambers is a word that's also used. I think it's also a good one, but I like microculture just because it has kind of this sense of these bacteria, in a sort of petri dish culture, floating around and all that. And so when you have these spaces of people who are in the know, who all know what's going on, who really understand, but who aren't actually in a physical inner circle, who aren't in a group of people that they had to work, right, the way that Lewis describes in his essay, when you have enough of these people, you start to create these kind of microcultures on the internet. And they create spaces on Twitter, and they create spaces in the comments of YouTube videos or Discord. And life starts, for the people who are in that, and I speak from experience here, this is something I've lived, starts to become this kind of imminent pressure of whatever the microculture is focused on, whether that's food or it's theology or politics or whatever, right? Everything starts to revolve around that. And suddenly your culture, rather than being, say, your family's culture or your nation's culture or the culture of your local school or your church, right? Your culture, the habits and the thoughts that you form and the social mores that you have, they start to shift to reflect this microculture on the internet. And this happens, and all you have to do is go and find a Twitter space, and if they're talking, listen in. Especially on theology Twitter, this is just a thing that happens, right? So we have these microcultures, and they are immanentizing the sense of, I belong to the cool kids table, I'm in, and they're kind of trading in this, right? But they're like my high school band, like my circle at the band table, right? They're not actually doing anything, right? Like, we weren't actually cool in high school, by any measurable standard. We were pretty lame, actually. And the people who are in these microcultures, who are in the know, who are really there, they have this thing going on, they actually have no impact or influence on the world. And I'll give you 3 examples of online spaces that become like this. The first one, and this may ruffle some feathers because this guy's popular, but there's a man on Instagram. His username is Redeemed Zoomer, and his whole thing is, we're going to take back the mainline churches. We're we're going to do this, all this and that and the other. And so he, to his credit, has really built a following online around this idea and kind of made this sort of movement. But he's created what I would call one of these microcultures, this kind of internet corner that people live in where they eat, sleep, and breathe this idea of we're going to take back mainline Protestant churches. Like, basically think of any church that you see downtown in a given city, or like First Presbyterian or First Methodist. Those are mainline churches. They're usually more theologically liberal and culturally liberal. He says, we're going to take those churches and we're going to bring them back to some form of traditional Christianity. And that's a great idea on the face of it, but there's this culture building around that where that's everything. Everything implodes on that center of gravity of, I know what's really going on. I know that there's this conspiracy of evangelicals have abandoned the mainline churches, and oh no, like they were all cowards and whatever. And the few, we band of brothers, we're gonna band together and we're gonna go take these mainline churches. And so that's a microculture. When somebody gets invested in that, that becomes what they think about. And when they start to order their lives around that, they have started to trade out whatever culture they're from for that microculture. It becomes all-consuming. Another example of this, and this is even trying to be candid and point at my sort of leanings and my theological beliefs. Out of Moscow, Idaho, there's a publishing house called Canon Press, and an author and pastor and theologian named Doug Wilson. And you probably know who he is if you're watching this. There are some of you who have spoken in the comments before not being religious, and you might not be familiar with him. But basically, he's a controversial figure in American evangelicalism. And he's a really good author. He's a very talented writer. He has a lot of helpful things to say. And for a lot of us in the world of theology, he's kind of like a gateway drug into really good and healthy theological ecosystems. So he exposed me, for instance, to postmillennialism, which is the belief that Christ returns at the end of his millennial kingdom and his reign, which is currently happening. And the basis of this is an interpretive schema called preterism. And again, if this is all Chinese to you, just hang on. We'll get back to the idea. But he also introduces these ideas of marriage in the family and of patriarchy in the house, and really good stuff, I would argue. But there's this marketing arm of the press that he's associated with, Canon Press, and they kind of have started to make a push into spaces online that have started to calcify into what I've classified as these microcultures. And so there are people, and I've met these people in real life, and I know them, who are on Twitter following Doug, or who are following Canon, who are watching the Canon app. Canon has an app, and they are keeping up with all these things, and their life and their sort of world is starting to calcify around what initially is a good thing, right? Really good, solid, introductory theological resources into everything is starting to like collapse in on this. And I say this in classification with the Redeemed Zoomer thing because what happens is you get these Canonites, people who live and breathe and eat and sleep, Doug Wilson, Moscow, and Canon Press, and they're not aware of maybe the broader conversations happening around that, some of the things that are not good about, Doug Wilson's theology necessarily. And again, I'm where he is for the most part. I'm pursuing ordination in the denomination that he's a part of. And I've met the man in person briefly, and I've shaken his hand and told him I respect him immensely. Very gifted. This is not really a problem with him, but there's this kind of subculture of people who start to see these things online. They start to calcify into this microculture where everything revolves around Canon and Moscow and postmillennialism and, being red-pilled or whatever, taking the proverbial red pill. So these people on Twitter, who are just normal guys and, usually godly, healthy men who understand what the Lord's calling them to, can have a tendency to start to take this in and not critically evaluate it. And then all of a sudden, they're saving the world. They're in on it. They know, right? They know the play that's being run, right? And I've been in that group. Uh, so this is not to speak to, again, the truth or falsity of anything claimed by Doug or Cannon or any theologians in Doug's camp. It's just the question then becomes, in your culture, in your life, and in your worldview, what does it revolve around? What are you focused on? Is it something that you got off of the internet? Is it these Twitter spaces? Some people who, you know. So anyway, I'll leave it there. You get what I'm saying, and you might have met people like this who have found a niche, they filled it, and this is like their culture. This is their thing. And what drives this a lot of the time is the same thing that Lewis talks about in the inner ring. I'm gonna belong here, right? I found out the real thing. And maybe that's not true of everybody who gets involved with that. I know it's not, actually, because I've met godly people who are associated with Redeemed Zoomer, and who buy into his whole mission. And I obviously know people in the CREC or associated or adjacent to Doug Wilson who are not driven by this instinct, but it's still an instinct that drives people. And that's why we're talking about it today. So what do we do instead? And I said 3 examples, by the way. The third one was seed oils, which we already talked about. So, what do we do instead? Right? If this is so bad, if this kind of internal focus and echo chamber of like, I'm trying to be in, I'm trying to be on the in with this group, if that's true, what am I supposed to do? I'm not saying, I'll start by saying what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that if you discover something, some new idea or some new thought that challenges what you previously believed, and you believe that, oh wow, I've really come to terms with something that I didn't know before, and now I'm going to change my mind and I want to research this and look into it. I'm not saying don't do that. You should find these things on the internet, listen to a good sermon, let it challenge you, whatever. I'm not saying that you shouldn't become involved with communities that have particular emphasis, right? You shouldn't, like if it's politics, for instance, if you're big into politics, I'm not saying you should not be. What I'm saying is that you need to start to recognize where you do and don't live. And so that's what we're going to talk about now, is you do not live on Twitter. Okay? This is not a shock to you. You probably know this, but you don't live on Twitter. Twitter's not real. It's not your home. I'm not trying to be patronizing here, but I say this because I feel the draw. You don't live on Twitter. You don't live on YouTube. You don't live on Discord, right? Discord is not your home. And these are not the environments that matter. They're actually, like I said, microcultures. They're these petri dishes of interesting conversations maybe happening, but they're not really doing a lot in the actual world, right? And I've had to divest myself of that belief, and it really is heartbreaking. When I realized, actually, no, my Twitter account is not doing numbers and people really don't care what I have to say, is when I realized, okay, this is not where I need to be. And I recognize the irony of telling this to you through a YouTube video. So just hang in there. We'll get back to that. But recognize it's not where you live. It's not where you are. And then recognize where you are, right? You probably, if you've found one of these niches or micro communities, microcultures, and you feel like you're on the inside, or you feel like there's some kind of thing that you've laid hold of, it's new knowledge to you, that has to be applied in a context probably foreign to where you got it from. And we'll put it like this. I apologize for that. We're back. Camera had some malfunctions. But anyway, as I was saying, recognize where you are as opposed to where you're not, right? So you're not in these online spaces, but where you are is around your friend who's maybe a university student, and he's studying, diets and things like that, and he's a scientist. I don't know. Just bear with me. So you talk with him instead, and you get new input, new interesting things, and you work with the people who are around you, the people that you have, over and against the people who you might know online or whatever, and you prioritize that. So that's the first thing you can do, and it's touch grass. Go touch grass. So develop these healthy communities and alliances where you are, and let those actually change and shape your values and beliefs coming from these maybe newfangled kind of interesting things that you're discovering online, and let those temper what you're getting into. And so, yeah. Don't do your thinking or your theology in a corner, essentially. So, how do you make a change in the world? Really, let's say you really do think there's a secret cabal of whatever people trying to make us eat seed oils. Well, how are you actually going to do something about that? Well, you're not going to do anything about it by going on Twitter and ranting to a group of people who believe the same thing as you. Go and talk with people that you care about and know, and do things a different way. And build a real culture where you are. If you think that something needs to shift in the current culture that you're in, great. But be patient and recognize that what you're getting on the internet is not real, person to person, and kill at all costs that sense of I just need to get on the inside. I need to have an understanding of these things because I want to be in on the secret or whatever. So those are microcultures. That's the cool kids table. Avoid it like the plague, and instead seek to build real relationships and communities where you are, and hopefully those will flourish. And whatever the idea is that you've picked up online, or whatever it is you think is good and want to build on it, you'll actually start to add value to the people around you instead of just clearly being somebody who's sold out to an internet fad, which is the danger that there is in all of this. So I hope this is helpful. I hope it makes sense. Go read C.S. Lewis's The Inner Ring. I'll put it in the link in the bio. And comment below. What are your cool kid table experiences, both in terms of what's funny and also just in terms of what are some things maybe that are drawing you towards these cycles of, internal monologue within these microcultures. What are those places for you? What does that look like? Anyway, I hope you're having a good day. God bless you. Bye.